See you here for an exciting conversation about connecting science with community leaders. We had a lot of laughs back there in that green room. That doesn't often, so you happen often. You're in store for a treat today. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ohlone and other indigenous people who have stewarded these unceded lands for 10,000 years. Currently, there are many different tribes here and bands working to restore their culture, heal from historic trauma, and protect their traditional territory. I've been talking with members and getting to know members of the Coast Miwok, a tribe near where I live, north of here, and I've been really humbling and encouraged. I've learned a lot, and I encourage you to go beyond these kind of sometimes performative land acknowledgments and get to know people in your community because they are still here. We're recording today's conversation for the Climate One radio show and podcast. It drops every Friday. You can subscribe wherever you listen. At the end of today's conversation, we'll take questions from the audience. There are cards on or near your seats here. Please write your name clearly, legibly, in a short question. And our producers will collect them and look at them, and they'll let me know, and I'll call out names in the order. We'll invite you to come to a microphone in the audience in the aisle over here. And if you're watching on the live stream, you can put your questions in the comment section. We'll try to get to those as well. Now it's my great pleasure to invite today's guest to join me. We're pleased to have Natasha Udu-gama as director of the AGU's Thriving Earth Exchange, which connects communities with scientists and supports them as they work together to tackle local challenges related to natural hazards, natural resources, and climate change. Also, Daniel Wildcat is professor at Haskell Indian Nations University and serves on the steering committee of Rising Voices, a network of tribal and community leaders and earth scientists that bring indigenous and earth sciences into partnership together. Really interesting. And Angela Chalk is an AGU Community Science Fellow and Executive Director of Healthy Community Services in New Orleans. Please welcome them to Climate One. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Good to see you. All right. I'm really happy to have you here. We were having a lot of fun backstage, and I want to begin by asking you to each to introduce yourself and where you're from, because this conversation about connecting science with local places, is inherently a kind of place-based conversation. So, Angela, tell us your story and where you live and where you're from and how that kind of shapes how you approach this work.
Okay, so thank you for having me. I am Dr. Angela Chalk, founder and executive director for Healthy Community Services, which is a community-based organization in the 7th Ward section of New Orleans, Louisiana. And if you are from that New Orleans area, you know that the city is divided up into wards, which is political jurisdictions. And so folks from the different wards are very proud of where they hail from. And so I hail proudly from the 7th Ward, which is a community that previously saw a lot of working class people from the masoners, the electricians, the tilers, and the iron makers, who a lot of the work that you see in the city were from those folks who lived and worked there. But I think the most important thing, as we were talking about earlier, is who I am. And I am the 4th of 5 generations who have lived in I currently live in a house that my grandfather won in a card game in 1942. And so the investment was made in me through education. And so I like to say that the elders are now receiving their return on investment in the education opportunities that were provided for me, and that the young folks are looking at me now to make sure that I get things right for the future as it relates to climate and urban heat.
So your grandfather won the house in a card game. You're lucky your dad didn't lose it in a card game.
Well, it was my mom. So yeah, yeah, it was my mom. And so the lessons from that my grandpa taught us is don't spend money you can't afford to use. And so that lesson has been with me throughout life. Yeah. So yeah, that's the thing. And I do know how to play cards, but I know limits and my risk.
And we're going to talk about risk,
Yes.
measuring risk. Okay, so
Yeah.
maybe playing cards is good for risk management.
Yes.
Daniel, introduce yourself. Where you're from, and
Yes,
how it
Fasan, Sangele, Zoya Ha Yuchi Ha Muskogee, Shudane, Adane. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Wildcat, and I am a Zoya Ha Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation, often known as the Creek Nation of Oklahoma. My ancestral homes were along the Savannah River in Georgia, but this is one part of American history that is included in most school books. The so-called Trail of Tears. There were actually many trails of tears, not just the one involving the tribes from the southeastern United States, but that's where my ancestral home is, in Georgia, along the Savannah River. We were removed on that so-called Trail of Tears to Oklahoma territory in the 1830s, and now most of my Yuchi relatives, a lot of them live between Sapulpa, Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, a little town called Mounds, Kellyville, and that's kind of a Yuchi territory within the Creek Nation. A lot of Yuchis live in that little area there. But I grew up in right on the Kansas-Oklahoma border in a small town called Coffeyville, Kansas, born on the Kansas side of Coffeyville, and really grew up there. My dad grew up in Sapulpa, Oklahoma. My mom was a Kansas farm girl that very small farm in southeast Kansas. And, I really identify that sort of extreme southeastern Kansas, northeastern Oklahoma as my home. Where I'm from. And, I've had a chance to really think about just recently, when you get to my age, you start reflecting on things. And someone asked me just about 6 months ago, just why did I think I was doing the work I'm doing now? And that's this interface between global climate change and its impacts on indigenous people. And, I got to thinking about it. I think one of my greatest impacts was my maternal grandparents, who had a small farm. Now, by small farm, this isn't one of these western Kansas wheat farms where they own sections of land. This was an elderly couple who lived in a small town, Valita, Kansas, and their farm was literally maybe an acre and a half, all worked by hand. And I grew up being able to go out there and visit. And as soon as I was able to drive, I would go out there because I enjoyed working in the garden with my grandmother and my grandfather. And they were elderly at this time. When I was like 16 years old, they were both, in their 80s. And but they were working in that farm, on that land, every day. And I think that really instilled in me a respect for people who work with the earth, not on the earth.
Yeah,
and I think that I have to acknowledge that, yes.
we're so disconnected from that. Natasha, what's your story and what place does it spring from?
Sure. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to speak to you today, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Udu-gama. I'm the director of AGU's Thriving Earth Exchange. My family hails from Sri Lanka. It's a small island just south of India, so those are where my ancestral lands are. I was born in Minnesota, of all places, because of a similar climate, of course. I've grown up in Texas and Southern Virginia. I now call Washington, D.C., and the surrounds my home. But I have come from a family that, though they are born and brought up in Sri Lanka, have always had a very worldly mindset. My father worked in Africa in the 60s and 70s. Both of them are educators, and so I grew up with a very strong sense of the importance of education, but also of people and places, and really trying to understand those people really, really deeply. So I've had the pleasure and the opportunity of working and studying in the United States, but also in Australia and the UK. And I think because of those experiences, I, went after those experiences, particularly because I was looking for the opportunity to work with people. And at the time in the United States, in the early 2000s, it was right after 9/11, there weren't the opportunities that there are now to do the work and be rewarded for the work, for working with communities. So while I was in the UK, for instance, I had the opportunity to work in India after the Gujarat earthquake of 2001. And then in Australia, my work was all related to community-based early warning systems in South and Southeast Asia. So as I was saying earlier, I think if there was a passport for being a world citizen, I would be loving that, because one of my favorite things is really connecting to and learning. I mean, I have such the honor to be sharing the stage here with Angela and Dan, who are some amazing people who have brought, the lived experiences of where they've come from. And so I just find, that shared common humanity something that I really resonate with, and feel really connected, I guess, to so many different people around the world.
So, Natasha, let's stay with you. In 2004, an earthquake in the Indian Ocean caused a tsunami that hit several nations in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, killed 230,000 people, and is the most deadly natural disaster, I think, in the 21st century. You went to Sri Lanka. What did you see there, and how did that shape the work you're doing now?
Yeah, so at the time, I was working with the Northern Virginia Center of Virginia Tech, and I was very lucky that I had a mentor who was, we were getting a lot of Homeland Security funds, but he and I were both very interested in working internationally. And when the 2004 tsunami struck Sri Lanka, which caused about 33,000 Sri Lankans and other, it was the largest disaster to affect Europe as well, because there were a lot of Europeans that were Swedes, Danes who were in Sri Lanka at the time during the Christmas holidays. So when that happened, I recall just feeling like, because I had that background in disaster management, I'd studied disaster management, I was very much called to wanting to be of support to, extended family back home, some in fact who had lost their lives, and wanting to give back to the country. So I decided to leave my paying job here in the United States to find opportunities there in 2005. And that was following a reconnaissance visit that I'd sort of instigated with Virginia Tech. And we did a lot of trips, we met a lot of people, but we didn't necessarily get a project that we had anticipated getting. And so I sat back and kind of realized, I really do want an opportunity to work there, but I didn't know how that was going to happen. So I had a pile of cards. I took the first card off, and it was the executive director of one of Sri Lanka's largest community-based organizations, and I reached out to him. And literally 5 minutes later, I kid you not, he wrote me back and he said, we need people like you. We'd really like you to come out, and we'll send you a ticket.
Your homeland was calling you.
That's right. So it was just like following this unction. And the thing is, the ancient Arabic word for Sri Lanka is serendip. So that's where the word serendipity comes from. And so I like to think that, my work is serendipitous. I also feel like it's also fated. So.
Right, and so now your organization, Thriving Earth Exchange, connects communities with science and supports them together to tackle local challenges. Over 250 projects in 15 countries. But how does it actually work? How does that? How do you connect science with local communities? It was just kind of seen. Yeah,
it's a great question. So community science is, and as per AGU, Thriving Earth Exchange, community science is defined as communities and scientists working together to address community priorities related to climate change, natural hazards, natural resources, environmental health, pollution, sustainability, and resilience. So everything between the core of the earth and the surface of the sun, and everything in between, are what our over 350,000 members and affiliates in 147 countries are able to do. So we connect communities who have these priorities to scientists who are interested in working with them to advance those community priorities so that they can develop feasible and impactful tools and solutions for those local places, for those neighborhoods, and really provide access to the science that they have never had the opportunity to have, or have not necessarily had the opportunity to work with hand in hand. Community science is what we do, and the way we do it is through partnerships. Since 2015, we've had partnerships, what we call community serving organizations. So these are organizations like ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, the International City and County Managers Association, and others who basically boast networks of cities, communities, neighborhood groups, and have helped us build a reputation of community science within their networks, such that those communities now come to us and seek support for these priorities that they have in their communities. And since that time, since about 2015, when we made those initial connections, we've had more and more, and then I would say in 2017, our connection with the Anthropocene Alliance has really helped us to exponentially support more marginalized, underserved communities. And since then, I would say our reputation of being able to support communities in a very authentic way has really enabled more communities to come to us through word of mouth, which is exciting.
Angela, what did you see in your proud 7th Ward there that led you into community science?
Well, for us, it was the lack of trees and the extreme heat that we were experiencing long before the summer of 2023. In working with the researchers that I was connected with, Dr. Derek Van Berkel of the University of Michigan and Dr. Amy Lesson of Dillard University, my alma mater, we were able to come up with the project of reforesting a 4x2 square block area to measure surface temperature and in planting trees. And so to date, we've planted 740 trees, 30 of which went in yesterday, and another 200 to go in later this planting season. And as a result of that, we're able to issue real-time heat alerts through a weather station that's located in the 7th Ward. And for us to gather data, there are sensors that are strategically located within that research zone. As a result of that, also, we're able to leverage funds from other philanthropic organizations to be able to plant greater trees in greater sizes and diameter. What Dr. Van Berkel is doing at the University of Michigan is developing a tracking tool so that we can monitor the size of the trees, the species of trees, the rate of growth, and whether those trees are surviving or not. This research project is IRB approved. At the time, Dr. Lesson was at Tulane, so it's an IRB approved research project. And Dr. Lesson works on the social aspect of what urban heat means to people, how we are working with each other, and when it's hot, how do folks do their daily essential activities? What does that mean for people with chronic diseases such as respiratory illness? And so what came out of that when we planted this second set of trees was right at COVID, is that residents in the neighborhood started saying to me, because I live in a neighborhood where people know each other for generations, they started noticing the calming effect that the trees had on them during the COVID epidemic when we were all quarantined. And so the benefits of trees are not only from the aspect of reducing urban heat and increasing the canopy, but it's the social aspect of it. It's the aspect of it when we look at it with managing storm water, how trees uptake water when we're planting native trees as opposed to just ornamental trees. And so community engagement was of the utmost important aspect of that, because neighbors were able to learn more about native trees as opposed to just a tree. And so now everybody in my neighborhood is a tree expert that they can tell you the species of native trees that they want planted in front of their homes in the public right of way. And when I tell you everybody's a native tree expert, they can tell you down to the growth of the tree, if it's deciduous or evergreen, And most folks will now want the flowering trees, the Chinese Taiwan cherry, which we know that we're on the same parallel with those other countries. So they can go that far to tell you that we're on the same parallel with other countries, that these trees will grow specifically in our area and are adapted to our climate. And that only comes from being engaged with residents to provide that community education. The other part was when we were concentrating on our research zone, when we had these series of community meetings, residents would say, hey, the avenue is looking lopsided, because we were focused on our research targeted area, but not taking into consideration that it was a main avenue that was separated by what we call it a neutral ground. Everyone else across the country calls it a median. And so when we looked at it visually, we were like, yeah, you're right. It is looking lopsided by having trees planted on one side of the avenue. So we then went back and were able to get additional funding to plant trees so that it was symmetrical, both in the targeted area and the area that was outside of the research zone.
Lots to those trees, cooling, calming, and all sorts of
Yes.
benefits of those trees, and monitoring them. That's just not planted and they're done. You have to keep them going.
And the residents have taken ownership on that. So when there's something wonky going on with the trees, they will stop me and say, hey, I need you to come look at this tree. And then the most important thing is that we were able to hire someone from the community to actually water the trees. And so that created a job for someone. And as a result of him watering the trees, other organizations that have planted trees, they hired this man. So his part-time job, is averaging somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 a year prior to him going to his full-time job. And all he does is water and monitor the trees. And we were able to hire folks from workforce development training to plant trees because of the size of trees that we're planting. Having volunteers to do that is just too much of a liability. But we're able to hire folks from workforce development and then local contractors, African-American contractors that are from the neighborhood, to be able to plant those trees. So we're creating a circular economy as well as reducing the urban heat island effect.
Triple win, something like that. Dan, I recently watched a video talk you gave on indigenuity. Tell us, that's a new word for me.
Okay.
And what does it mean to you? Explain.
Well, indigenuity has a lot of pieces, but the simplistic description of it is it's basically taking indigenous knowledge and wisdom and applying it to solve very contemporary problems, modern problems. It disabuses people of the fact that when you talk about indigenous cultures, indigenous knowledge systems, some people think that's all about the past. No, these are living systems. These are living intellectual systems. They're spiritually connected to all of life that surrounds us, very place-based. And so basically it's a combining of, indigenous with ingenuity, and said, well, what we need today is indigenuity. And I think that's really something that's worth exploring for a couple of reasons. One, we're talking about the power of place. That's what community science is ultimately about, a people and a place. And I think indigenuity is the three key parts to it. First part is we live in the age of the Anthropocene. So far, an human-centered Earth has not been very good for the balance of non-human life on this planet. And I think the advantage of indigenous knowledges is they are decidedly non-anthropocentric. So for me, I don't think of a wildcat as an animal, I think of it as a relative. I carry that name. That is embodied in many native cultures where people's clans are identified with the animals, the plants, features of the natural world that they share. Not romanticism, that's indigenous realism. In fact, it's more consistent with modern science than a lot of other views that what people think about things. We're all related. So indigenuity is a way of thinking about how we address the problems that we face now, remembering that it's not all about us. We have a lot of teachers out there that water, the land, the air, the plants and the animals. In Zoyaha traditions, those are relatives and they are teachers. They can teach us something if we pay attention to them. So I think, those are features of indigenuity that I think are desperately needed today. We're talking a lot, in community science, those of us that are working in the area of global climate change, about finding a new lens, a way in which we can understand the world. And the beautiful part of indigenuity is it is by its very nature, non-hegemonic. There is no indigenous view per se. There's a Choctaw view, there's a Seminole view, there's a Haudenosaunee view, there's a Miwok view.
You're not monoliths. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Because the knowledges are shaped by that unique relationship between a people and a place. So indigenuity would suggest to us that if we want to address climate change, don't be looking for that one magic pill or bullet. We're going to have to apply different solutions in different places because we all know climate change will manifest itself differently in different places. And I think that's a really good message to explore today for young people and for scientists.
Right. Yeah, it is, and it's unequal. It's unfair in lots of ways. The global north certainly. Where trees are or not is related directly to redlining, where banks lend and didn't lend.
Yeah, and as we talk about that, no one likes to discuss the elephant in the room about racism. And it's not unheard of for, as you speak about with redlining, about why communities are the way they are. And in my community, we were on what was once swampy land, but it was undesirable land. It was cheap land for people to be able to purchase. And currently now it's by design, in my opinion, that we don't have these tree-lined avenues that perhaps the more affluent sections of New Orleans did, and we once did. Along the North Claiborne Avenue corridor, we once had thriving oak trees similar to what we all see on St. Charles Avenue. But because of urban development, the interstate system, the I-10 system came through and clearly wiped that out during I can remember during the 60s when the interstate came through and just moved people out. And so as I come along as an adult to try and bring this back and get people to understand why we need trees, this North Claiborne Avenue corridor was a bustling African-American business corridor. It's cut off. It remains cut off. And now how people talk about taking the I-10 down, but what do we do now? Because times have changed from the time that interstate was put up to where it is now. So we can there are things that we can do to mitigate that. And that's involving the community to say, hey, this is what we want in our community now based on the atmosphere and the climate that we're dealing with now. And we use the analogy when people don't want to talk about racism and environmental justice. We have to talk about it because folks say that, oh, it's so traumatizing. Well, it's traumatizing to the people that live there because we live it every day. But it's something that has to be said because without the friction to move it forward, to change, similar to the conversation that we had about the tire. If you have a flat tire, if you continue on with the friction and ignoring it, you're going to continue with a flat tire. But when
Friction's necessary for movement and progress.
Friction is necessary for movement and change. And so as a Black woman growing up in a Black community, we have to have that friction to bring attention in order for there to be change if what we say is true about all of us being equal. And actually, in my mind, I don't want equality, I want equity. And there's a difference. And so people need to understand the difference between equality and equity so that we all can thrive and have a just life that's promised to us by the Constitution, because if I'm correct, we are promised, endowed by certain unalienable rights that all men are created equal. Then we want this in our communities, and particularly now, and I can only speak from the Black perspective, Black communities now realize, especially with the trillions of dollars of federal investments, that we're the ones that are in the driver's seat that can dictate the way our communities are changing, and we no longer want to be studied are extracted, we want to work with scientists to understand our community so that we can come up with real solutions for our community. So no longer are the days where you come in and extract information and distract us from the real issues. We want to be at the table and working with scientists to resolve our issues, and that's what Thriving Earth has done for my community.
Natasha, one project you're working on is Cook County, Georgia, where a new plant creating wood pellets is proposed. Wood pellets are used to put into furnaces, sometimes to replace coal, sometimes with coal. The community there doesn't want this. There's resistance there. Can you talk about that one or another one where communities are trying to address the justice that Angela has talked about?
Yeah, so I'm not, that's definitely one, but there are so many. And I would say like one of the projects that really struck me in the early days was back in 2017 in Evanston, Illinois, an environmental justice community just outside of the waste transfer station in Evanston, Illinois, was very concerned about the impacts that waste transfer station was having on the health of the community. A lot of those mostly Black, poor, underserved areas of Evanston were basically suffering from asthma and other health effects of the waste transfer station. And so they, really banded together. Luckily, they had a great sustainability coordinator who was very open, and they had an environmental justice committee in that community in Evanston that was very active. So as we were developing this Thriving Earth Exchange project, the sustainability coordinator was so open to this environmental justice committee being part of the process to actually search for so I was managing that project at that time. So prior to 2019, we did not have community science fellows like Angela and amazing community leaders like Angela as well, who were actually doing these projects. So I managed this particular project, and what we found is that, and of all of the projects we've done, there was never a project that came to us and said, we want the Environmental Justice Committee to be part of the selection of the scientist. So they were actually part of the vetting of the scientists that we put forward. I recommended some scientists, and they said, okay, we'd love to be able to be part of this selection. And so that, I think, because of that, they had even more support from the entire community. And eventually they were able to set up air quality monitors around the waste transfer station. The scientists who were selected to be on this project were eventually selected by the mayor of Evanston to be on the climate committee. And they were able to find subsequent funding. I think it was like $300,000, don't quote me, but something pretty significant where they were able to actually keep those air quality monitors going over time. And the scientists have built that trusting relationship. Yeah. So just as Dan was saying about, having these solutions really, really focused on different communities, that is what Thriving Earth Exchange is helping to do. And we're not just trying to do this in a way that just does one-offs. We put everything up online. We try to, as much as possible, document every single process to the extent possible. And we make sure that, all these processes are online and are available to other communities so that when they come, they can take a look at what are those solutions that are out there, what has been developed by other communities, so that they can replicate, adapt it as necessary, and then make it and tailor it to their community. So, community science is, again, not a monolith, just like Indigenous communities are not a monolith. It really has to be focused on each individual community.
Dan, in the projects that Natasha and Angela describe, it sounds like while there's community leadership, the scientists come from outside.
That's right.
Right? And what's your view of these outside experts and how they can kind of really connect in a non-arrogant way?
No. Well, I think we've got to break this notion of extractive, activities that go on often by scientists, and I think that's beginning to happen now. It's a generational thing. We did a program, so part of my work right now is on something called Rising Voices Changing Coast Hub. That's a convergent science hub, part of the Coastlines and Peoples programs with NSF. We did a session yesterday, and one of the messages, that we sent was that, we're past this notion of scientists coming in and looking at Indigenous people as research subjects. Our project, which is Convergent Science, is we look at the community members we are working with as the co-creators of the science that we are producing. They're not research subjects. They're on equal footing with the scientists, the physical scientists, the university-trained scientists. So I think what's going on now, and we said
But that's just jumping. That takes a lot of humility for some fancy PhD person, right? I mean,
you are right. You are right. Now that's something that we've got to model. We have to embody that, and so I'm lucky to share the podium here with two strong women who, although they're very strong, they embody a humility in their work. And I mean, I think this is what we need, is to quit promoting this notion that the scientist has to know it all, can never admit they don't have an answer, and instead really developing some tools to learn how to do engagement. That work is going on right now. So my good friend James Ratlingleaf, he's doing a thing with some other Native people programming called Creating Ethical Space. I'm working with some colleagues from like Dr. Julie Maldonado and Uros Petrovich from Haskell, and a number of Indigenous scholars doing a training called A New Lens for Engagement. And we said yesterday at AGU, the American Geophysical Union, we believe that physical scientists now should all be taking training in how to engage with the people of the places where they are doing their work. This is new. No one's ever told a geologist or a person who's working with plate tectonics, it might help if you knew something about the people that experience those earthquakes.
That's a
you
lot.
try to predict.
Yeah.
Okay, then I might need to take that. I might need to lead that course, and if anyone wants to start that, I'm available for hire.
Well, we'll be glad to do it. But this is a paradigm shift. You're right. This is not easy work, because who's going to pay a scientist to go out and meet community members and break bread with them and everything? That's not part of their job. Well, it's part of their job now.
Yeah, it is.
And I think that's what community science is about. You've got to know your community. You've got to engage with the community. And that check the box idea, we were talking about this
that check the
earlier.
box is over.
That's gone. That's
gone.
gone. That's not going to work anymore. You can't call us up and say, hey, we've got this big grant, a couple $1 million. Would you like to be our partner? And we're going like, we don't know you.
Yeah.
Who are you?
Angela, what do you see in terms of arrogance and humility of people coming in to say, yeah, I mean, 7th Ward, New Orleans, working class neighborhood? I can imagine that.
Oh, I experienced it just recently because of the summer of 23, the high heat indices. And, I've been doing this research now 6 years. And so someone offered me $100,000 for our baseline data. And being a small community-based organization, they thought that $100,000 was a lot of money to me. And it was insulting. And I told them that is insulting. So
It felt extractive.
Yeah, so it's like, well, I'll give you $125,000. I'm like, take your $125,000 and go somewhere else with it, because if you're offering me $125,000, that means that you can get $10 million somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so you have to, working in community, you have to know who you are and whose you are. And I'm working with fantastic researchers who they have skills, I have skills, and together we make this a powerful research project. And so I could not even begin to entertain the thought of taking a monetary settlement without even first consulting them. And then first of all, $125,000 was insulting to me to think that, you can wave that check in front of me and say, hey, this is a lot for you, you ought to take this. So I don't know, I didn't know whether to be insulted as a black woman or to be insulted as a scholar, that you thought that $125,000 for my research was something that I should be grateful for. And this is what's occurring in communities of color. So if you're doing it to me, a woman that's educated, what would you do to someone at a community level if it was the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts that were doing this? And so I told him, take his $125,000, and y'all know what else I said. I wasn't as polite. Because, I live in the community in which I serve. And so it wasn't about me. It's about the people that live in my community.
And even well-intended and well-educated people can come in with
yeah.
presumptions. Natasha, you went to a small fishing village in Bangladesh to talk about risks, and you went in there with some presumptions about what risk was for them that was different than the people on the ground. So share that.
Yes, that's a really good point. Yes, when I went and I did my PhD research in a small fishing village in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, I was trying to understand, like, how did those communities understand early warning systems, especially as it related to cyclones that were very frequent in Bangladesh. And I remember asking them that question, so, what are the risks here, And their responses really took me by surprise. I remember just being flabbergasted that it was health, the access to, education.
Right. Yeah.
We don't, we're used to being flooded all the time. We have, indigenous ways of working on, supporting our community. And I mean, this was even mentioned in the plenary on Monday by Amitav Ghosh, mentioning about how, Bangladeshi communities are often, they have all these external consultants coming in, and they tell them, we need to build this mound, and this is where you're going to go should there be flooding. Right. So yes, I was. That was definitely a moment in my career where I was like, okay, this is really. And they saw me, because I was also a brown-skinned person, as being like one of them. And, they were kind of shocked that, I was even making this assumption that, the risk was anything but what they were saying, And then also just, making sure that you are in the room with the right people. And I was told by my Bangladeshi colleagues, you need to really make sure that, you're not going to get the responses of women if you're in a mixed group, because they will not speak up. So, having, really getting to know the community before you try to, even ask any questions, and just understand a little bit about those communities, so that you can understand, like, where they're coming from and what sort of knowledge do they already have. It was a pivotal moment for sure. I mean, there were many pivotal moments. I mean, even working in Sri Lanka, my parents' motherland, after the tsunami, there were many moments where I made incorrect assumptions. But I think, having had those experiences, having been on the ground, is pivotal. Like, if you don't take the time to really get to know communities of different types, you're never really, and that's where the funders really need to understand that it takes time to build these relationships. We can't just get funding to do work with communities and expect to have, the results in a year or two, And so I'm hopeful that with the uptake of community science, in the last 9 years that I've been with Thriving Earth Exchange, we've seen an exponential increase in interest and participation. I mean, we have like 314 actually projects to date completed and ongoing, and 695 community leads who've worked with us, 404 scientists who've been working with us, and 227 community science fellows, including Angela here, who have been who have been trained up in community science and are now working and helping us to reach more communities. Because in the old days, we were not able to do, like, I was managing 20 to 25 projects a year up until 2019. And then, having this community science fellows program has been pivotal. Like, it's really enabled us to connect one-on-one, getting that really precise, adapted, tailored approach to each of these communities through these amazing fellows that are, coming to us and going on to be ambassadors for community science. We have folks who have gone on. There's a postdoc in Singapore who is one of our prototype fellows who's saying, I want to help you develop a Singapore community science hub. Let me know when you can do that. And already they've supported some really remote villages in Papua, Indonesia, to be able to do some flood vulnerability assessment. So
Right.
this is sorry, I'm just
I've
going
seen
off on a tangent here.
projects in Maryland on community choice aggregation, flood risk in Boston, all over the country and in the world. Angela, what outcomes have you seen in the projects you've been involved with? What specific outcomes?
I've seen my community come together, not just the legacy residents, but for the residents that are new and moving into the community and having a true sense of community. People are talking more with each other around the common issues that we have of heat, of urban flooding, and the lack of access to food. So all of those things come together at the intersection of public health and climate health. And my background is in communications and public health. And when I first started with those disciplines, everyone was like, well, those disciplines don't go together. Well, yes, they do. Because unless I'm able to effectively communicate with someone and meeting someone where they are, I can't begin to tell them about the social determinants of health in a language that they can relate to. And again, it goes back to the investment being made into me through education to be able to come back to my community, to be able to explain that in a way that people get it. And so we had high incidence of chronic respiratory diseases, gun violence, but these trees are giving folks a sense of community, and we know that communities with green spaces have less violence. So I am waiting to see when the social benefits, the results are going to be from this research. Now, had someone told me that I needed to wait at least 10 years because trees grow slow, I might have said maybe this is not the project for us, but it was the need of the community. And so
Can you get people to think that trees are relative, like Dan would say?
Yes, absolutely. Because folks are beginning to understand the benefits of trees, and they're watching the trees as they grow. So when there's something that's going on with the trees, I get the call, and I have one of my elders who called me at midnight. I don't know why she was up at midnight, but she called to tell me that one of the gentlemen at the local bars was dancing with the tree. And so I was like, I will handle that in the morning. but people are
Taking the relative thing a little far. Yeah,
yes,
right?
but people are taking ownership and realizing that these trees are now a part of our community, and then the eco-service benefits that we're seeing from having the trees in our neighborhood is giving us a greater ecosystems benefit return.
Tree, that's a new tree hugger kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, new tree hugger.
Natasha, the culture of science and academia is still publish or perish. There's a lot of pressure. And I've heard you talk about there's the industry path and the academic path for PhDs. So how do you balance that pressure to to get published, which is kind of like sucking data out, offering Angela money, or it's like, so how do they balance that? Because there's a lot of pressure in academia these days.
There is, and I would say there's a lot of change happening in academia. I think in the last 10 years that Thriving Earth Exchange has been around. This is our 10th anniversary. AGU has made a lot of strides in really building out the community science space. We now have something called the Community Science Exchange, which is an opportunity for scientists, community leaders, and others to get together on an online space. There's a journal, Community Science Journal, where it's open access and basically providing the opportunities for more academics and students to get rewarded and recognized for the kind of work that they're doing with communities. So there's even an opportunity there to share resources on that hub. So we're more and more trying to get communities themselves as they're interested to share resources.
But you go for that tenure track position, they're not going to say like, oh, did you talk to the people in that community that you got the data from? They're like, where's your prestigious journal publication?
Right. And it's slow, but there are a lot of different organizations that are working on this, even including Pew. Pew has a whole burgeoning sort of group that is working to really understand what are the opportunities to incentivize this work. There are like professor of practice now, like my soon-to-be former boss, Raj Pandya, will be a professor of practice. And those types of professors will basically be rewarded more for the work that they're doing with communities rather than the number of publications, the type of publications that they'll be doing.
Right. So Dan, how should a scientist coming into a community from the outside work with the local knowledge, especially if they're not trained to do that?
Well, I think, it's going to be a process, okay? So again, we're doing the work now, places like AGU, places like the Rising Voices, program at NCAR. It's over a decade old now, but, that work started at NCAR as a result.
NCAR is a National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Yeah, National Center for Atmospheric Research. And now we have, actually a program there and a center, Rising Voices, which gave birth to the Rising Voices Changing Coast Convergent Science Hub. We couldn't have done that proposal, $20 million proposal to create a convergent science hub at this little tribal college, Haskell Indian Nations University, if we hadn't built those relationships. So here's what I would suggest. I think that we need to encourage scientists today to create those spaces within their institutions where they are welcoming in community members to be a part of that space for science, for research. Now, here's the main challenges. You're right. We still have very much this kind of public and publish and perish kind of notion. I think one way to address that, and the community scientists are doing it, I try to do it in my work, I still publish, but I'm not writing to scientists. I want writing to community members. I try to write my book so that my aunties, my uncles, my nieces, my nephews, and when my granddaughter gets to be about 13 or 14, she could read my book and understand what I'm saying because it's important. And I think this is really part of the hard work we've got to do. We've got to instill a culture of humility. We've got to instill a culture of respect. And, we do talk a lot about rights because, marginalized people and indigenous people have had their rights denied often. But from the indigenous side of things, we add to rights an acknowledgement that as human beings, if you take this view I was talking about earlier, where we're all related, not just our human relatives, but our plant relatives, our animal relatives, the earth, the land, the air, the water, then we have to accept inalienable responsibilities. I think the big shift right now in science is scientists are beginning to understand those days of just you doing your science and all you do is talk to other scientists. I think that's really not being seen as tremendously valuable when we're facing the kind of imminent existential crises on this planet we're facing now. We don't need people to retreat into their disciplinary silos. We don't need people thinking in boxes. I've been advocating, along with a lot of scientists, that maybe it's time to listen to indigenous people. They never thought in boxes, and we never worked in silos, and most of your neighbors don't think that way either, and they don't work that way. When we go out in the world, we're not thinking, what's my economic decision going to be? What's my, culturally appropriate decision? I mean, we're just trying to live. And I think that is where indigenous people can bring us back to understanding a lot of the knowledge we need is right out these doors. We were talking about the work that's being done right out here.
Right out there, It's amazing because we don't think of rats as relatives, and yet we know that modern science uses rats as for medicine because we're so genetically close.
Exactly.
And yet we don't view them as it's how do we handle that? It's like we use them because they're so close genetically, but we don't view them as relatives. that just science and technologies that science has spawned have a long history of harming vulnerable communities, being extractive and using certain communities as guinea pigs. I'd like to ask each of you how science can undo past harms without causing new unforeseen ones. Angela.
Oh, you're going to go to me first on that one.
You're closest to me.
Okay, so the first thing that I would say is, as everyone else has said, you want to work with communities and being respectful. That's the number one thing. Being respectful and building true relationships with folks. And if there's something that you cannot do, then just simply say that. People can accept the truth rather than you just habitually lying to them about an issue. Because if I'm expecting you to do something and you can't do it, just come to me and say you can't do it, rather than leading me on. Because that is the worst kind of way to think that you're going to get something done and then come back to me and say, hey, I have this proposal, you want to be on it. Well, no, I want to be in on the decision to see if this is a good fit for us. So being respectful of people's
Pull you
time.
in as a...
Stop. There's a community engagement spectrum, and you need to look at that to see where you're at. Are you tokenizing me? Are you placating to me? Or are you really want me to be involved with this? And so that starts with respect and mutual respect, and realizing that all relationships don't have to last for a lifetime. They can have a beginning and an end point. I may not only want to be with you on this project. I may decide I don't really like your technique, but for the benefit of my community, this was good. But later on, if you call me up, I'm good. But being respectful is the first thing that I would say.
And Dan, how about you? Science can undo past harms without causing new ones.
I think we've misvalued technology. We treat technology as if it's a variable that's going to solve everything, and what we've seen is that what has the age of the Anthropocene taught us? That most of our technologies have unintended and latent consequences we weren't smart enough to see. I.e., case in point, I am at this point very concerned about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Because artificial intelligence is machine intelligence. I'm not a machine.
And it's being designed by a bunch of white guys.
Well, it seems like it at this point, and I think that's part of this mindset that technology is going to save us. I'm not anti-technology. Let's revalue it. So I came up with an algorithm several years ago, and I said, well, what technology should be equal to is the 3 C's over E. Community, culture, communication over environment. You should always have a positive value. If that community is strengthened, communication is strengthened, and culture is strengthened in that relationship between a people and a place, that's good technology. I can point to a number of technologies, as everyone in this room can, that have been very destructive to people's culture, their community, and don't we all know about the damage of what's happened to human communication in the age of the internet? Bad actors can make
things
bad
are
things happen.
unintended. Yeah, the internet. I was a reporter at the early days of the internet. It was supposed to democratize all sorts of things in communication, and it's now kind of controlled by a powerful few. Natasha, we hear about decolonizing science. I'm not sure what that really means, but how can science, advance while undoing past harms?
Well, interestingly enough, we were talking about publish or perish, right?
Yeah.
My PhD thesis was called Partner or Perish. So I think it's really important that we partner, and we partner authentically. So I think that's part of decolonizing science, is really having, as Angela was also talking about, these really trusting relationships, and having deep partnerships, really getting to know people, connecting authentically. I mean, one of the things that has helped me in my career is making true, authentic connections with people, and I think really taking the time to really understand, the communities that you are working with, the people, the individuals themselves, where they're coming from, their context, their knowledge, and having the opportunity too, having the opportunity from funding agencies to do that, I think is also, a huge part of it, right? I mean, you can't just do that. You can do that for ad nauseum, I guess, and then you might not get paid to do it. But I'm hopeful, as we, as these conversations continue to happen, as this work is continuing to explode, and it is starting to explode, which is really exciting, that we will have more opportunities to make these authentic connections, to really be able to overcome some of the, adverse effects of maybe bad technology, but by making sure that and I think we're in a new era, right? After the pandemic, there's been changes in the nature of connecting with people. And I think we're in the midst of a new sort of season, a new generation of connecting with people. And what does that mean for the future? And how can we, make those authentic connections, build those authentic connections, and make sure that they are sustained over time.
Yeah, I think this is really important in the climate conversation because global warming often devalues the local. It's like, oh, we gotta, this big scale. If it doesn't scale, it's meaningless. And I think that, that old bumper sticker that, think global, act locally kind of ought to be revived because the global warming conversation pulls us away to this macro level that I think it gets us away from where we are and the people closest to us. As we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you, I'm not going to start with you because I'm scared to start with you. Whether I'm a scientist or not, how can I get involved in working to solve environmental problems in my community? Dan, what's a...
Yeah, okay, so the first thing you do is start where you live, okay? And I think, in fact, I just was jotting some notes on the flight out here, trying to do some good work today for that carbon offset, for the carbon that I contributed going into the atmosphere by taking a jet plane here from Kansas City. But I thought about this idea of community and how many people don't live in communities anymore. They live in subdivisions, they live in gated communities. So I'm going to start real simple. Build a neighborhood. Know your neighbors so you can talk to them about what you can do to improve the air quality, the land quality, reduce waste, improve, your carbon footprint, reduce it. These are community issues. They're place issues, and I think there's good work to be done there. So start by, if you don't know your neighbors, even if you're in an apartment building, knock on the door and say, hey, you want to have coffee sometime? Let's just visit. Let's get to know each other. I think the biggest enemy we have right now to community science is the fact increasing numbers of people live in anonymity in very large urban areas. And folks, we can't afford to be anonymous anymore.
Right.
We need to know our neighbors.
If you have an induction cooktop, invite people to come over and see how cool your induction cooktop is, or
there you go.
Something like that. It cleans up the air. Angela, what can people do?
Well, I live in a neighborhood where people know me now as the tree lady, so so I would just have to echo that, but be incremental in change. Because nothing is going to happen overnight in grand scale. So start small and build incrementally. And that has been the part of the success for Healthy Community Services, by realizing that everyone has a role to play, whether you're a homeowner or a renter, black, white. And my neighborhood is changing because we're getting more of a Hispanic population now as a result of the changes from Hurricane Katrina. So we're still feeling the changes from Hurricane Katrina and gentrification. And so it's no longer a neighborhood of family and things of that nature. So we as a community have to adjust and realize that everyone is involved in this issue. And so it's been, for me, it's been rewarding to see the change, and I embrace being a tree lady. It's what I do. Again, it's incumbent upon me to be able to make those changes. But most importantly, listen to young people and bring them together with the elders, so that together the technology and the wisdom can come together. And
Yeah.
that would be the thing that I would say do.
Get the young people off their screens and with the elders. I
Yes.
like
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
Natasha.
So I would say, reach out to, obviously reaching out to your community, your neighbors, everything like that. But if you're a scientist, reach out to your scientific society. I mean, AGU is one that has a plethora of resources. If you want to get involved with communities directly, Thriving Earth Exchange is an opportunity to do that, of course. As a young scientist, we're having, as Angela was just saying, like, a lot of youth are now very interested, the early career researchers, mid-career, even late career, but a lot of those early career researchers, they're getting into this because they have not seen an opportunity to really authentically connect with communities, and they really wanted to be able to do that. So find those opportunities to connect with communities through your different societies, there's so many different resources out there. Community Science Exchange, of course, is another one. But really, truly just try to just see that common humanity, I think that's really what it comes down to. Like, we're all connected in that way. We're all one, really. We're just different pieces, different manifestations of the one. I would say, like, that is really what it comes down to.
That was the thinking of climate one, by the way. We're all one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one climate is issue number one.
Exactly.
Natasha, Dan, and Angela, thank you so much for sharing your insights here on Climate One. Today, we've been discussing community science with Natasha Udu-gama, director of AGU's Thriving Earth Exchange, Daniel Wildcat, professor at Haskell Indian Nations University, and Angela Chalk, executive director of Healthy Community Services in New Orleans. This show has been produced in collaboration with AGU, the American Geophysical Union, and I'd like to thank Josh Weinberg and all the folks at AGU for their support. Also like to give a shout out to the Climate One and Commonwealth Club World Affairs teams for making this happen. That's my colleagues Adam, Dan, Alex, Megan, Billy, Brad, Jenny, Wency, and Ben. And podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe or give us a rating and review. Thank you for joining us here in the room, and thank you for joining us online. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.